My name is Ryan, and my world is screws and thermal paste. I wander this New Mexico wasteland, building what I need from the scraps and ghosts of humanity's technological past. I often wonder, which is the machine just going on beyond its time? The computers or me?
Welcome to the final episode of Project Apocalypse PC, where I show and tell what I've constructed from the mostly electronic scrap of my hometown of Albuquerque. So, well, this is not exactly a build for such and such price video. I am going to say how much I spent on each system and which parts I used to build it, just so you can tell what I got for free and what I had to pay a little bit for. Now, right off the bat, I want to explain how I get parts for free. It's actually pretty simple. You mostly just want to kind of lurk on Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace, and Nextdoor, things like that that have local marketplaces. Sometimes you'll even find stuff in the paper, but I feel kind of like I'm aging myself even saying that. But and you want to usually go early in the morning. I find that people post this stuff right when they get up, and it goes real quickly. Somebody contacts them immediately. And that is where I get computers that are almost always broken. They either have a part in them that's broken that stops them from booting, or they've been totally stripped of hard drives, memory, everything, and it's just a case, motherboard, and maybe the processor and cooling fan. And so, to the people that are getting rid of these, they're worthless. And usually a lot of this stuff that I'm working with is 10 years old. I have some stuff a little younger than that, but it's basically scrap is what I'm saying. And the whole point of this project is taking what would be trash to others and showing how useful it can still be. Because my response to people saying that the supply chain of parts could be disrupted is not just try to buy the fastest PC you can before the parts are gone. It's, imagine a decade where there were no new computer parts and we had to just keep making do with what we had. And so that's where this project comes from. Now, before I get into what the builds are and what they can do, I just want to do one more quick thing on legality and morality of picking up scrap computers. So if people don't care what you do with them, it doesn't matter. If they just want it gone and they're getting rid of it for free, that's not a big deal. But a lot of people want their stuff electronically recycled the proper way so that they can, get a tax write-off or just to know that it went to the right place. So it is absolutely not legal to go around and tell people that you are responsibly e-recycling their computers and then take them and, just wipe the hard drives, reinstall their copy of Windows and activate it and resell it. That is absolutely immoral. There are some parts that you can refurbish and reuse from computers that are e-recycled. Sometimes you can even just take the stuff home and use it as long as it doesn't go back out into the market. But in general, when people think their stuff is being recycled, the law is that it needs to be recycled. And so every single one of these parts, the people who gave me these, they were just trying to get rid of them. They did not expect any sort of receipt from me for tax purposes. And I told them right up that I was going to put this stuff in a YouTube video for my channel. And I gave them all links to my channel and said, hey, you can check out your stuff all repainted and reconfigured and mixed up with some other parts here in a few weeks. It's all for the fun of showing people what you can do with what would be trash. And so there's nothing in here that I told anyone that I was going to recycle their stuff where maybe they would have not given it to me otherwise. And that is immoral. You should not do that. So, that out of the way, and without any further ado, let's get into these systems and what they can do. I'll be starting with the most powerful system here, which I call the Turk. And if you're very familiar with the history of automation, you're probably familiar with the story of the Mechanical Turk, which was a fake chess playing machine. There was actually a guy inside, so it's actually more like the father of R2-D2 being played by Kenny Baker. But I digress. And where it comes into our apocalypse references is lots of people who are into the history of machines know about the story of the Mechanical Turk, which was 18th century, I want to say, 18th century fake chess-playing robot, which even after its exposure was showed off all over the world. Even as a fake, it was an incredible machine. Now, in the Terminator, the Sarah Connor Chronicles, the TV show, the Turk was a chess-playing AI that was one of the components that would lead to the development of Skynet. So, of course, Sarah Connor and her crew had to go and destroy it. So that's where it comes in, the naming scheme on this. Now, the Turk here is an excellent example of what you see most commonly in these cheap build videos. And that is, believe it or not, the guts of this are Office PC parts, and I've added a graphics card to it. Now, where these parts came from is I got two HP PCs, which you'll see the cases for later, and they each had 1155 motherboards. They were basically the same thing, and one had an i3-2120 and the other one had an i5-2400. Now, the one with the i5 had a bad board, and the one with the i3 had absolutely nothing wrong with it, besides that processor was not really useful for my purposes anymore. So I combined them and I put it in this super old case. And then the other things I got, now these are the only parts that I had to spend money on. Everything else came out of the pile, as I'll refer to it here on out, which is all the scrap stuff I paid nothing for. So I bought a 500 watt power supply, eBay local pickup for $22, and then there were two graphics cards. I bought $30 for both, and both were untested for parts, and the one that went in this one, the GTX 970, the guy told me straight up that it had VDU blue screens before. Now fortunately, I was able to fix both of them without too much trouble. It's easy fixes, and I have heavily benchmarked them since then, and they're both fine. So I lucked out for 30 bucks. So even let's say that this one was worth 20 of the 30 and the other one was only worth 10, this is a well under $50 PC. Most of it is free parts. And spray paint, of course. I spent a little bit on the paint. So what this guy is basically like is a lot of those builds you will see, where it's an Office PC plus a graphics card. Now in this case, I made it even cheaper by getting a broken graphics card and fixing it. But this is still a very capable computer. I'm always amazed. You'll look at this and say, i5-2400, that's ancient, that's ridiculous. But the crazy thing about the i5-2400 is I keep pulling it out year after year and building low-end cheap builds with it, and every time it is not the part bottlenecking me, even with a newer graphics card. And once again, that's the case here. As you can see here in Doom Eternal, which just came out recently, I am not being benchmarked by, I'm not being held back by the CPU and bottlenecked at all here. It's the graphics card. And so we are at high settings, which is actually more like medium for this game. 1080p, full resolution scale. I'm using Afterburner rather than the built-in metric, so it's not showing resolution scale, but resolution scaling is disabled since I was able to maintain well above 60 frames per second, even without having to scale down from 1080p. But as you can see, this GTX 970 is struggling at what's basically the medium settings for the game. Well, this i5-2400 from 2013 is still trucking along and could handle it being run at higher resolution and settings. That's pretty darn amazing. I don't have any other just brand new system pusher games, so I have to go with Resident Evil 2, which came out last year. I don't have the new Resident Evil 3 remake. But it's still a pretty decent graphics card pusher, as you can see here. It's pretty well CPU optimized as well. So once again, this ancient i5 is still not bottlenecking a GTX 970, which came out several years later, and was a pretty high-end, upper mid-range card for the time. So it'll honestly amaze you how well these older processors can still do, and that it's usually still your graphics card holding you back. Now finally, a game that's a favorite of mine, wasn't real popular when it came out. Actually, it was kind of hated by a lot of people, but now is having sort of a resurgence, and there's finally lots of people for me to shoot at again, is Sea of Thieves. Now, Sea of Thieves, although it's a couple years old now, it can be a bit of it's actually kind of a pusher in both CPU and GPU, depending on what settings you're at and what resolution you're running at. And I was able to play this game at, legendary settings are no problem. You can maintain, usually around 90 frames per second. If you want to go all the way up to mythical, which are the highest settings, it will you'll be basically maxed out at 60 frames per second in 1080p. And I usually like to not max out what a computer is capable of when I'm playing a game for hours, because it's just not very great to, be running as hot and as loud as you can. I like, the sound pollution is annoying, it heats up the room, and it's harder on the computer. So I would say, probably not quite maxed out, but it still ran very well, which is, it's very nice for considering this is an under $50 scrap PC, and it's running it as well or better as an Xbox One X. So that's pretty darn good and hard to complain about. So overall, this PC, you could game on this today. If you're still on a 1080p monitor, and honestly, this 970 can handle a few games at 1440p, this is a gaming PC. There's nothing wrong with this as a gaming PC. 16 gigs of RAM is going to be plenty for quite a while. It has a very small SSD and a pretty small platter drive, but considering that this is stuff that I got out of the heap, and I already had that SSD. It's a used SSD I bought for, I believe, $15 in the first place. So I don't know what its value is, but I'd say we're still under $50. And it makes it very functional in the end. You have limitations you have to worry about of small storage space. There are some things that will definitely push this processor in this day and age. But for what it is, to be able to play the newest games and to have no trouble with video editing, accelerated browsing, things like that, can't complain about that. And this is all stuff that people were willing to throw away or sell to me cheap because they just didn't want to fix it or deal with it. And I'll show off some shots of me fixing the graphics card here. But when you fix graphics cards, it can it can go the easy way, it can go the hard way, and it can go the pretty much not worth your time way. And the easiest way is what happened with this one, where I was able to clean out the heatsink, totally remove all the old thermal paste and the thermal pads on the other side of the board, replace it all with new top quality thermal paste and thermal pads, and put the clean heatsink back on, and it was fine. That's as lucky as you can get, especially with one GPU like this that would sell for $100 on eBay easily. That's a pretty good way to go. Now, you can have worse problems. A lot of people think that repasting will just always fix a graphics card. No, you're not always that lucky, and anybody that says that hasn't done it that many times, which I have. And if it does need to be reballed, which means that the chip, the actual solder points where the graphics processor is held down, are bad. If you have to reball it, a lot of people will try to do it with the oven. Don't even bother. Not worth it. Doesn't last. Sometimes just totally breaks it and you can't even fix it with the proper tools after that. Now, the proper tools is, if you want to be cheap, a heat gun, and it's a similar method where you cover everything else with foil, but you use a heat gun to only heat the parts you're pointing at, and it's much more precise than putting the card in the oven. In general, sometimes you get as lucky as I did and it's an easy fix. A lot of times you can still limp it along for a little longer with a heat gun. In general, I would say with graphics cards, if it has failed before and you know it's a hardware failure, not just a driver failure or something, don't expect that you're going to be able to fix it and it's going to run forever. Just think of it as on borrowed time and that you have to replace the graphics card. By that same token, even though I've had no troubles with this since I cleaned it out, and I honestly think it was just tripping its temperature sensors and there was nothing wrong with it at all, I would never resell computers with parts that I have repaired and I'm not 100% certain about. If I haven't followed the same procedures that a professional company would, refurbishing and selling at something, I wouldn't even sell it cheap to my neighbor. It's just the way I am, and I would honestly recommend you don't do the same, because it's not worth the bad blood between someone else and you, where they don't understand that you just did your best and you sold it to them for a fair price for what it was. All they understand is that it's not right, and you did the whole, like they talk about, used car lot of the bubble gum and paperclip stuff, and it's just not worth it. So that's where I come from on that. This is another one of those of a lot of people feel differently and do all sorts of shady stuff of reselling parts that they maybe shouldn't, but that's where I come from. So this is the Turk, the most powerful of the systems I built from the scrap and cheap parts. Our next PC is Valkyria. Now this is a great example of what a PC would be like that was, pretty good for its time when it was built in the late 2000s, and has been significantly upgraded once since then, and then now just able to kind of ride off into the sunset to where it's about to fall off the cliff of obsolescence again. But the thing about computers like this is a lot of times, even as crazy as it seems, you can still put a better graphics card even with an old processor, and you can still play a fair amount of games. So one thing about this guy, now as far as how I built this one, this is, if you've been following the series, the original computer that I bought for 30 bucks just to mess around with, to, you know, practice my building skills and just play around. But the reason that I spent money on some of these parts is because there are things that you need. You'll notice I used large cases for both of the most powerful PCs, and they also have an upgraded power supply of at least 500 watts. So just, I mentioned this in one of the previous videos, but anytime you see those cheap build videos and they take an office PC with a 300 watt power supply and they stick in a mid-range graphics card like an RX 570 or 580 or a GTX 970 like I used in the Turk, and they just slap it in there with that 300 watt power supply with that tiny little case with little tiny fans, yeah, I'm sure it runs long enough for the video once again, but that is not a system with any longevity that is of any use to someone. I mean, I know they don't care, they just throw it in the pile and that's the end. But someone couldn't actually use that for any length of time. They would just blow that power supply and need a new one. So when I talk about what money I spent on these and why, the systems that needed a power supply, I upgraded the power supply. I put them in large cases so they had enough airflow. All of the above. It's not just a trick that'll only work for as long as I'm recording the video. So that being said, it was most of a $30 PC that went into this. I used the case, the motherboard, the power supply, and then the other of those graphics cards from the for parts GPU lot was this HD 7850. And then other than that, it's all free stuff, hard drives from the pile. Oh, except for the final thing of the CPU I put in here, which is a Xeon 5450. So it's a pretty old one. I mean, we're talking way back in 2008, and I had to do a modification, which I'll show some footage of me doing this now. But socket modifications to run a more powerful processor, as crazy and ridiculous as it seems of a way to upgrade, has been going on for decades. I mean, one of my Macs, my Power Mac G3, has a socket riser so that it can use the newer series processor than what came with it. In this case, it was much easier, and that was actually the reason that I wanted to do this one in the first place, is because it's as easy as just sticking this sticker on here that bridges some pins and tricks the socket into thinking that this is a compatible processor. So I did that on this one, and although this CPU is so old that it won't even let you start some games, like for example Doom Eternal would not even start. Vulkan requires newer CPU instruction sets than what this thing is even capable of. But I was able to get Resident Evil 2 up and running, and as you can see here, both the GPU and CPU are pretty well maxed, which means I actually paired really well the 7850 and the 5450. But as you can see, both are pretty well maxed, but it is able to play the game at 1080p in low settings, and in many cases it sticks up near 60 frames per second. You could drop down to 720p for a fully smooth experience, but I would honestly prefer to play at 1080p and drop below. Now, when it comes to more casual stuff, like Counter-Strike Go, absolutely no problem. Runs it totally fine. You can usually stay above 120 Hz, so even if you have a higher end monitor and you consider yourself a little more competitive, you can still play. I mean, everyone plays Counter-Strike on low. So 1080p, low settings, this is still a very capable rig, and basically built out of scrap. We're talking 7 to 8-year-old GPU and a 12-year-old CPU. So yeah, still hasn't quite fallen off the cliff yet. Won't boot some newer games like Doom Eternal, for example. Just cuts you off and says you don't have the newest technology. You don't even have reasonably recent technology. You can't even start this game. But unless you have a lockout like that, even something like this can still run some modern games, and it's pretty amazing. Next up is Furiosa. Now, this is more like the AMD side of what you'll see popping up in most places for pretty much scrap office PCs. So this is one of the earliest of AMD's APUs. So the nice thing about a system like this is that it has graphics built right into the processor. So you won't have to worry about finding some old graphics card just in order to have a system up and running. Now, the drivers on this, they stop about 2015, 2016, so you can install the newest drivers, but it is still plenty for accelerated browsing, accelerated video use, pretty much any basic tasks. And you can actually still run a few games on this. Now, it's not anything real high-end, but a lot of times those aren't the games that people are playing competitively and are into the most. If you are willing to, sacrifice a few drops in frame rates and play at 720p, Counter-Strike Go is still very playable on this incredibly low-end old APU from 2012. And as far as something that you can actually run pretty well, World of Warcraft Classic, if you're willing to stick with classic settings and don't need any of the enhanced graphics, you can maintain a pretty consistent 60 frames per second running around playing this game, which is plenty good for most people to play WoW. Most people don't require to be able to run WoW at too much above 60 frames per second. So that's about it as far as games, but for a PC that you can basically just get Windows 10 running on, boot up, and you can still use today for accelerated browsing, office use, stuff like that, just because of how balanced these APUs are. It's really not a bad way to go for just a cheap PC, especially for a kid, because, you know, they can play some stuff. They can play a few games that their friends are going to be into. I didn't test Fortnite, but I'm sure it would run it low. Minecraft would probably also run it low. But just as a decent all-around computer that has some sort of graphics without having to buy a graphics card, this is a pretty good way to go. Now, this one is all free parts. I didn't pay a penny besides the spray paint and the decals. There was nothing that went into this that didn't come out of the pile. So not too bad for a free PC. This guy here is Raggedy Man, which if you'll remember, that's what Tina Turner calls Mad Max in Beyond Thunderdome. So that's where that one comes from, and the meaning is this is basically the crap box that I took all the leftover parts that still kind of worked and put together a PC out of. And, well, the reason you're not seeing it running up on the screen is because all of these parts have been repaired at least once, and I was hoping they would make it through, but I was doing basic system benchmarks and something else went fizz on the motherboard, and I was not willing to stay up all night, another night trying to figure it out just to have another working PC. So, teachable moment. Sometimes stuff that is trash is really trash and is not worth your effort. It's not worth it to take an old socket 775 motherboard and just keep looking for other parts that are bad, when most likely it just has that aging issue I've talked about where boards just get too old, and it's the whole, like, you know, plugging the bladder and the water keeps squirting out in different places, you know, it's one of those. And really, you should just not waste your time. This stuff is really old, and socket 775 motherboards are a dime a dozen. So I'm sure I'll come across another one. Raggedy Man will return. But just as a teachable moment on this, don't expect, no matter how smart you are, even if you could fix it. I mean, of course, I could fix this motherboard. I can go through and test all the circuits and figure out what went bad and replace a part and it'll work again. But how much is my time worth to me to take stuff that is really not all that useful, and I'm just kind of doing it for the pride of saying, I never have a system I can't get working? This is kind of one of those situations, and in this case, I'm just going to let this motherboard go. It was the lowliest, most cruddy looking of the ones that I had in the pile, and I tried to get it going, and it just, you know, wasn't worth it. I'll come across another 775 motherboard that has nothing wrong with it. I'll pop it in there, and it'll be fine, and Raggedy Man will ride again. So our last machine is almost a gag entry. This guy is the Feral Child, named after, of course, the Feral Child, or Feral Boy, from Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior. And this one, although it's a bit of a gag entry, you could say, it's still not a complete joke. Now, while I didn't even bother trying to get games to run on this, as you can see from the specs, it wouldn't be probably the best use of my time. I'm sure it will run some older stuff. But what makes this guy interesting is it is basically a netbook in a box. They called them net tops. But it has the NVIDIA ION graphics and chipset, which was basically, because of course we have to have graphics for everything, NVIDIA made an IGP for netbooks called the ION. And I've always wanted to get my hands on one and play around with it. And I finally, this guy was just in one of the piles I got with no power adapter or anything. And my universal power adapter had a tip for it. I was able to put a hard drive and memory in it and get it fired up and going. So yeah, it's going to be fun to play around with this a little bit, and I probably will mess with some really old games at some point, but it's not going to run anything even remotely modern just because the drivers and all the support and stuff is too old. But something like this, because it has that graphics processor that makes it more capable of running accelerated video, you can actually get some use out of something like this to, say, hook up to a projector in a conference room. And it'll have enough to run your basic videos. It'll do some web browsing, not super fast, but that can still be really useful rather than people having to hook up their laptops and things to a conference room. If you have some sort of storage attached to your network where you can just put projects and videos and then have a small computer hooked up to it, that's very convenient. Another thing is to hook this up to your network. A lot of people to do a NAS, a network attached storage, will just plug a portable hard drive into their router, which is supported by most routers. But I've honestly had problems with that just killing the drive way sooner than it should have, because the router is not great at how it stops and restarts the drive when it resets itself and all kinds of things like that. So having an actual computer of any kind controlling your personal network storage is usually better than trusting your router software to do it. So something like this is more than enough for that, to where you could either put a pretty large hard drive in the 2.5-inch bay inside this thing, but you could also, with its, looks like it's got 4 USB ports on the back and a couple more on the front, you could put a pretty decent sized storage. And although these are only USB 2, that's usually fast enough for network attached storage for most people. So just sort of a fun little extra I got in the box, this NVIDIA ION based net top to play around with. But even to this day and age, it still runs Windows at the minimum. Went to sleep and I had to wake it up. But it meets the minimum requirements to run Windows 10. And if you turn off all of the visual enhancements, it does pretty well and runs Windows 10 without too much trouble. And that'll close us out for this round of systems for Project Apocalypse PC. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. I just have a few more things to close out. So I actually got another free computer at the last minute, didn't have time to work it into the video, but this one is a slightly newer AMD APU. So I'll probably play around with this a little more in the future and have another computer that I will paint up and make look cool like these ones. Now, another thing, so I didn't mention paint costs. My total cost for all the parts was about $95. It was the $30 computer, $30 for those two 4 parts graphics cards, $9 for the Xeon, a couple bucks for the sticker for that, and then that power supply. And we tried to use a bunch of leftover paints, but we also did have to buy a few more paints. So we spent about 15 bucks in paint, but honestly, could have done a lot less if we had just used paint that was more effective. So we used both Krylon and Rust-Oleum 2-in-1 paint and primers. The Krylon paints, all the different Krylon ones we had, the old ones in the garage, new ones we bought, were just not as good. The Rust-Oleum paints were way better, and especially this 2-in-1 ultra cover stuff. This, in all the colors and types, was by far the best for covering the plastic and metal surfaces of the computer. You could even do it in one coat if you weren't too picky. So if you are looking to repaint computers and have them look, you know, kind of cool apocalyptic paint jobs like I did, or you want to do more professional looking paint jobs and take it to a gaming tournament, I would recommend just start with some of this stuff in this series by Rust-Oleum, and you're going to save yourself a lot of time, because pretty much all the different Krylon paints we used just were no good at all at sticking to the computers. All the vinyl decals, we custom made them. Now we did use fonts and stuff that we downloaded. We started with some pictures and stuff we modified to make a bunch of them. But they were all cut on this Cricut vinyl printer. This is an Explorer Air 2. So yeah, in order to get them looking cool like this, I think they look cool, it is going to take a little bit more investment. I did not make those decals with stencils and spray paint them on there. Raggedy Man text, that was done with a stencil. But the rest of these are cut vinyl from this vinyl cutter. So it definitely, it takes a piece of equipment that does that thing very well to make them look like that. It's not just something I did with Sharpies and paint. Beyond that, you'll notice that there was Windows on all of these computers. Now, I mean, a lot of people will probably just assume, oh, hey, pirate Windows, no big deal, and aren't going to call me on this. But I'm going to say how it is that I get Windows on these systems, and it's actually not pirated. And Microsoft, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. So Microsoft has kind of shot themselves in the foot by offering free upgrades to Windows 10 in the past to any computer that had Windows 7, 8, or 8.1. Almost all of these computers, or some of the other ones that I pulled parts from in this pile, had a working Windows 7 or newer install. Most of them were Windows 7. A few were Vista, but I was able to get enough Windows 7 keys together to make this work. And so I'm able to do this a little differently. I have a Microsoft developer account where they can just pull me up. I open the ticket from there and they open me up. They're like, oh, hey, you buy lots of our stuff, Mr. Lecoq. Like, clearly you would never, ever rob us. I mean, yeah, it's like, you're a great customer. We'll help you out. So usually I'm just like, hey, I got a bunch of old computers. They were upgraded to Windows 10 in the past. The hard drives died. I'm replacing them. Can I just give you the Windows 7 keys off the sticker, and can you just, migrate these and make it work? Like, seriously, I've done it in the past. I don't know. Even if it looks wrong, I don't know, nothing, whatever. And they're usually cooperative because they just don't care. I'm not doing this to resell a whole bunch of these. It's not a big deal. They look at me, they're like, oh, you give us a bunch of money, whatever. But if you don't have an account like that where they can see that you were just like their favorite customer, act really stupid and just basically be like, oh, I upgraded this for free to Windows 10 at some point, but I don't remember anything. I don't know anything. I'm blind. I have no fingers. Just like be as difficult as possible. And eventually they will just turn a Windows 7 key into a copy of Windows 10 for you. And it's kind of a jerk thing to do. Don't do this to resell it, not just because it's immoral, but because Microsoft's not stupid. You'll notice that now they have you register computers to yourself with your Microsoft account. So if you're selling a bunch of these and they're going out and then people are registering them to themselves with their Microsoft account, they can see that you're ripping them off and you're just reselling computers with Windows 10 and you're trying to get free keys off of them. Whereas me, they might even, go see my YouTube channel and they'll just laugh about it and see this video because, they don't care. I'm not reselling any of these. And that's the final thing after that of, yeah, that's my trick to get Windows. Kind of a jerk thing, I know, but once again, I don't do this a bunch to resell it and just be ruining Microsoft's day all the time. These computers are all still going to be around. I'm not reselling these. I'm keeping these. My wife and I are hoping to start fostering soon, so I'm hoping I can set up my own little LAN, have a bunch of foster kids that each, have a computer to play with, and we can all play games together. Who knows? They may not want to spend any time with me. But I'm not going to be getting rid of these. These will still be around. And like my other computers that I pull out from past projects, you'll see in the future that these still work. That's something that kind of offends me about a lot of these cheap build videos is I know from a guy who's built a bazillion systems that they're just doing it for the bragging rights to say they built it so cheap. And, like I've mentioned before, the power supply is going to blow, whatever. It's obviously something that will only last for the video. It's important to me to build working systems, and that's why I spent any money at all. I wasn't kidding or exaggerating when I've said in these past videos that if I had 6 months and no limitations on space, I could have got everything I needed for free. There's lots and lots of computers out there that have 1 or 2 broken parts or just have nothing wrong with them, and people aren't willing to deal with them. And if you put the time to digging in through a pile of computers that are broken, and you're gonna have to haul some stuff off and deal with it properly, or hoard it in your shed or whatever, you're gonna end up with some stuff that wasn't useful. But you can go through and build any of these systems that I've demonstrated here with all free parts. If I had had enough time, I could have found all of this stuff in computers that people just wanted hauled away and didn't care. So, yeah, Project Apocalypse PC. I hope you guys had as much fun watching it as I've had doing it. I think I'm going to do some more of these specialty builds. Honestly, the painting and the decals were the most fun. And they came out looking pretty cool. A number of people have been like, oh, that's cool. I would love it if my computer looked like that. So I don't know if I'm quite ready to open up a paint shop yet, doing computer paint jobs, but I'm definitely going to do a few more of these project builds where we do a cool, fun paint job on them. I'm going to keep doing some, movie parody, silly stuff and just try to make this a little more than the guy sitting in his shop bragging about how cheap of a computer he built and what it can do. I have more respect for your time than that, and I'm always trying to show that by making my videos more entertaining, more fun, and trying to give you something new. I rip off what the bigger channels do. I try to do what the successful people do. But I'm also trying to do stuff you haven't seen before, so there's a reason. It's like, this guy who comes on, after everything on YouTube's been done, what can you show me? Let's find out.